Horse becomes a midwife during a storm. What happened next is unbelievable. Maria had always felt safe in the village. Nestled at the edge of a vast and wild forest, the village was a place of quiet simplicity where life seemed to follow an unhurried rhythm. She had grown up here, in a humble cottage built by her father, a skilled carpenter who had passed down his knowledge and love for the craft to her. Her mother, a kind-hearted woman, had taught her the ways of the household, how to care for the animals, manage the small garden, and keep the hearth warm in the cold months. Maria had no desire for a life beyond the village. The smell of fresh bread baking, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, and the sight of her loyal horse, Spirit, grazing peacefully in the meadow, these were the things that made her feel at home. If you love animals and want to watch more amazing stories, don't forget to subscribe to help the author. Let's begin. Each morning, Maria rose early, just before the sun began to peek over the horizon, casting soft, golden light on the dew-covered grass. She had always loved the mornings, the quiet stillness of the world before the bustling of the day took over. The first thing she did was tend to Spirit, brushing his coat and offering him fresh hay. Spirit had been with her for years, ever since she had been a young girl, and their bond was one that ran deep. He was more than a horse. He was her confidant, her protector, and her constant companion. Maria often joked that Spirit understood her better than anyone else. After taking care of Spirit, Maria would make her way to the village square, where the other villagers would be starting their day. The square, though small, was always lively. Neighbors greeted one another with smiles and waves, and there was always someone to chat with about the weather, the crops, or the news of the day. Maria loved this sense of community, the comfort of knowing that everyone around her was looking out for one another. The village, though small, had everything they needed. A bakery that made the best pastries, a general store that sold everything from fabric to tools, and a small inn where travelers could rest for the night. Maria's days were filled with small, purposeful tasks. She helped her mother in the kitchen, preparing meals for the family and occasionally for the neighbors as well. She enjoyed cooking. There was something deeply satisfying about taking fresh ingredients from their garden and turning them into a warm, hearty meal. After lunch, she would often take Spirit for long rides through the woods that bordered the village. She knew the forest well. Every trail, every tree, every rock. She loved the peace it offered, the way the world seemed to slow down the deeper they ventured. It was as though the forest held some kind of magic, a quiet stillness that spoke to something deep inside her. But even as Maria reveled in her peaceful life, there was a part of her that longed for something more. She wasn't unhappy, far from it. Her family was loving, her friends were kind, and she had everything she needed. But every so often, when she was alone, a feeling of restlessness would stir within her. She would stand by the edge of the forest, watching the distant hills, and wonder what lay beyond. She had heard stories from travelers who passed through the village, tales of far-off places with bustling cities, towering mountains, and vast oceans. These stories sparked something inside her, a curiosity about the world beyond the village. Maria had always been a dreamer, her imagination fueled by the stories she had read and heard. She imagined herself riding through unknown lands, seeing things she had only read about in books. There were times when she wondered what it would be like to be a part of something bigger, to venture into the world and make her own way. The idea of adventure, of leaving behind the safety of the village and the routine of daily life, seemed both thrilling and terrifying at the same time. She wasn't sure what was holding her back. Was it the fear of the unknown? Or was it the comfort of the life she had built here, a life that seemed to offer everything she needed? Yet, even as these thoughts swirled in her mind, Maria found herself returning to the familiar rhythm of village life. She didn't want to be discontent. After all, she was grateful for what she had, a roof over her head, a family that loved her, and Spirit, who had been with her through all of life's ups and downs. But it was hard to ignore the gnawing feeling that there was something more for her, something waiting just beyond the horizon. Every evening, after the chores were done and the sun had dipped below the horizon, Maria would sit by the hearth, watching the flames flicker and dance. Her father would often join her, telling stories of his younger years, of the adventures he had experienced before settling down in the village. He would speak of faraway places and exciting journeys, and Maria would listen intently, imagining herself in his shoes. It was during these moments that she could almost feel the pull of adventure calling to her, a whisper in the back of her mind telling her that one day she would have to leave. But for now, she remained in the village, comfortable in her routine. She found joy in the simple moments, the laughter of her friends, the warmth of her family, and the bond she shared with Spirit. They were small, ordinary things, but they brought her a sense of peace. In the quiet of the evenings, Maria would often wonder what it would take for her to step beyond the comfort of her home, to follow the whispers of her dreams. She wasn't sure what lay ahead, but one thing was certain: when the moment came, she would have to be ready. Maria was, for all intents and purposes, a woman of the village, and she had always thought that her life would follow the same peaceful path as those who came before her. She loved the simple joys of her world, the warmth of family, the comfort of routine, and the safety that came with being surrounded by people who knew and cared for her. The idea of stepping into the unknown, of leaving the village behind, was not something she had truly considered. It seemed like a distant fantasy, something that belonged to someone else. But little did Maria know that her life was about to take a turn that would challenge everything she thought she knew about herself, about the world, and about what it meant to truly be alive. It would be in the midst of a storm, when she least expected it, that Maria's world would be changed forever. The quiet, comforting life she had always known would be swept away in an instant, and she would be forced to confront the unknown. The adventure she had always dreamed of would soon become a reality, and it would be far more challenging and transformative than she could have ever imagined. In that moment, as the clouds began to gather on the horizon and the winds began to shift, Maria had no idea what was coming. All she knew was that her life was about to change, and that she would never be the same again. Maria had never truly considered the possibility of leaving her village. For years, she had been content with the rhythm of her life, the steady cycles of the seasons, the predictable patterns of her days. But sometimes, late at night, when the world was still and the only sound was the whisper of the wind through the trees, she would feel a restlessness stir within her. It was a feeling she couldn't quite shake, a quiet longing for something beyond the confines of the village, something undefined but deeply alluring. She had tried to ignore it, to push it aside, convincing herself that she had everything she needed right here: a loving family, a loyal horse, and a community that supported her. Yet the whispers of adventure continued to haunt her thoughts. Maria often dreamed of leaving, of exploring the world, and discovering what lay beyond the familiar hills and forests. But each time she thought about it, a wave of doubt would wash over her. What was there out there for her? The stories of far-off lands, bustling cities, and untamed wilderness seemed distant, almost foreign. The life she had was good, too good, perhaps. There was safety and comfort here, things she had come to cherish over the years. But in her heart, she knew something was missing. The desire for adventure was a slow-burning fire, one that, though not yet fully realized, was beginning to grow stronger with each passing day. It was during a routine afternoon, as Maria set out on one of her long rides through the forest with Spirit, that her life would be irrevocably changed. The sky, which had been clear and bright in the morning, suddenly darkened. The winds picked up, rustling the leaves and bending the branches of the trees. At first, Maria didn't think much of it. Afternoon storms were common in this part of the world. They usually passed quickly, leaving only a brief downpour and a fresh, cool breeze in their wake. But as she rode deeper into the woods, the wind grew stronger and the clouds grew darker, gathering in thick, ominous swirls above her head. A feeling of unease settled over her, though she tried to dismiss it. Spirit, too, seemed to sense the change in the weather. He began to toss his head nervously, his ears flicking back and forth, and he pranced in place, eager to turn back toward the village. Maria slowed him down, gently calming him with her voice. But even as she did, The first rumblings of thunder echoed through the trees, low and distant but unmistakable. Spirit began to quicken his pace, as though he sensed the storm approaching more acutely than Maria did. She urged him forward, but the storm was gaining on them, and soon the skies above opened up in a torrential downpour. Maria had ridden through storms before, and she knew how quickly the weather could change in the forest. The ground beneath Spirit's hooves became slick with rainwater, and the trees, once sturdy and firm, now seemed to sway dangerously in the wind. As the rain grew heavier, Maria realized that returning to the village would be impossible. The path was becoming obscured by the deluge, and the dense forest around her offered little protection from the storm's fury. In that moment, panic began to set in. She had always been resourceful, had always trusted her instincts, but the severity of the storm was overwhelming. Her clothes clung to her skin, and the wind whipped at her face, stinging her eyes. Spirit was now skittish, shifting from side to side as if he, too, feared what was coming. Maria tried to steady him, urging him forward, but the storm seemed to have a mind of its own. The trees creaked and groaned under the pressure of the wind, and lightning struck in the distance, casting an eerie light across the forest. She could barely see anything through the torrential rain, and the familiar trails she had known so well now felt foreign and dangerous. Desperation gripped her heart as she realized she had no choice but to find shelter. But where? The forest was vast, and though she had wandered through its depths many times, she had never ventured too far from the village. She didn't know what lay beyond the familiar paths, and in the heart of the storm, every direction seemed equally uncertain. Her thoughts raced. Should she continue on foot, seeking a place to shelter, or should she trust Spirit to lead the way? There was no time to waste. She needed to find safety. Spirit seemed to understand her thoughts. Despite his unease, he began to move more deliberately, picking his way through the forest as if guided by some unseen force. Maria had never seen him so determined, and though she had always trusted him, something about his steady pace gave her a sense of hope. Perhaps Spirit knew something she didn't. As they rode through the storm, the world around them became a blur of rain, wind, and thunder. Maria clung tightly to Spirit's mane, her eyes straining to see through the downpour. The forest seemed endless, stretching on, with no sign of civilization in sight. Maria's heart began to pound, her mind racing with fear. She was far from the village, too far to reach safety in time. But Spirit kept moving, his steps sure and steady, as though he had a purpose. Then, just when Maria thought she couldn't go any further, a flicker of light appeared through the trees ahead. It was faint at first, barely visible through the rain, but it was enough to spark a surge of hope in her chest. She urged Spirit toward the light, her heart pounding with anticipation. The rain continued to pour down in sheets, and the storm raged around them, but the light grew brighter, more distinct. With a final push, Spirit broke through the trees, and before them stood a small cabin, its windows glowing with warmth and light. Maria's heart leapt in her chest. It was a place of refuge, a sanctuary from the storm. Spirit slowed to a stop as they approached, his hooves clattering on the wet ground. Maria slid off his back, her legs trembling with exhaustion. She could hardly believe what she was seeing. A cabin, isolated in the forest, offering shelter from the tempest outside. She ran toward the door, her breath coming in quick gasps, and knocked with all her strength. She was met with silence at first, and a sinking feeling of dread crept into her chest. What if no one was home? What if she had stumbled upon an abandoned cabin, left to the mercy of the storm? But just as her hope began to wane, the door creaked open. An elderly man stood in the doorway, his face weathered by time but kind and welcoming. His eyes softened when he saw Maria, drenched and desperate. Without a word, he stepped aside, gesturing for her to come in. "Come in, my dear. You're safe now," he said in a raspy voice. Maria barely had the strength to thank him before stepping over the threshold, grateful to be out of the storm's fury. She collapsed onto a nearby chair, trembling from the cold, her body aching from the ride through the rain. The man quickly set to work, tending to the fire in the hearth and offering her a blanket. As the warmth of the cabin wrapped around her, Maria allowed herself a moment of relief. She was safe. The storm outside raged on, but she was no longer alone, no longer at the mercy of the elements. For the first time since the storm had begun, she allowed herself to relax, closing her eyes and letting the warmth of the fire seep into her bones. But even as the storm howled outside, Maria knew that this unexpected turn of events was only the beginning. The storm had changed everything, and though she had found refuge for the moment, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to be forever altered by what had happened. The cabin, the old man, and the storm itself had brought her to a crossroads, one that would lead her into the unknown. As the fire crackled and the storm raged outside, Maria couldn't help but wonder, what had she gotten herself into? And what would the future hold now that she had crossed this threshold? Maria had always been a woman of quiet strength and determination. Her life, though not without its challenges, had been predictable. She woke up every morning to the steady rhythm of her village, tending to her home, her family, and the animals that had become such an integral part of her world. Her bond with Spirit, her loyal horse, was a symbol of her connection to the land and the life she had built. But the storm had changed everything, and now, as the fire crackled in the cabin and the storm raged outside, Maria knew she had crossed an invisible line. Her comfortable, predictable life was gone, swept away by the fierce winds and torrential rain. She was now standing at the edge of something unfamiliar, something that would challenge every belief and every assumption she had about herself and the world around her. The elderly man who had welcomed her into his cabin had been kind but distant. He offered her shelter, food, and warmth, but there was a quiet tension in the air. It was as if he too understood that the storm had brought them together for a reason, though he said little about it. Maria tried to rest, to regain some strength after the exhausting ride through the forest, but her mind raced with questions. What was she supposed to do now? Was this just an unexpected detour, or had the storm forced her onto a path she hadn't been prepared to take? And where would this path lead her? The old man didn't speak much about himself, though he did tell Maria that he lived alone in the forest, far from the nearest village. He had built the cabin himself many years ago, choosing solitude over the bustling life of a town. Maria couldn't help but admire his independence, though she also felt a pang of unease. She had never known a life so isolated, so removed from the warmth and connection of community. Her own life had always been shaped by the ebb and flow of village life, by the familiar faces of neighbors, friends, and family. The thought of living alone in the wilderness, with nothing but the forest and the occasional traveler for company, seemed both foreign and daunting. The storm continued through the night, the wind howling outside the cabin and the rain drumming against the roof. As Maria lay in the warmth of the cabin, her thoughts turned to Spirit. Her horse, though resilient, was not immune to the dangers of the storm. The idea of leaving him out in the rain gnawed at her, but the old man assured her that he would be fine. The forest is his home, too, the man said with a knowing smile. He knows how to take care of himself. Maria felt a flicker of reassurance, but she couldn't entirely shake the worry that tugged at her heart. Spirit was more than just a horse to her. He was her companion, her confidant, and the one being who had always been there for her when she needed him most. In the morning, the storm had not abated, though the intensity of the rain had lessened. The wind still howled through the trees, and the sky remained a deep, stormy gray. Maria knew that she couldn't stay in the cabin forever. As grateful as she was for the shelter, the storm had shifted something within her. She could no longer ignore the call of the unknown that had been growing inside her for so long. The path she had always known, the safe, predictable path of village life, was no longer enough. She needed to see beyond the trees, beyond the familiar hills that had framed her world for so long. It was as if the storm had unlocked something deep within her, a longing for something more, something beyond the comfort of home and the confines of her predictable existence. She knew she had to leave, but how? The storm had made the forest treacherous, and the path back to the village was all but impassable. She couldn't just leave Spirit behind and wander aimlessly through the wilderness. There had to be a way to find her way back to the village, but more than that, she realized, she had to find a way to understand what lay beyond the familiar boundaries of her life. She couldn't explain why, but something inside her told her that this was the moment to take the first step into the unknown. The old man had offered her food and advice, though he said little about his own life. He mentioned that he had lived in the forest for decades and that he knew it better than anyone. "The forest is full of paths," he said cryptically, "but not all of them are easy to follow." His words resonated with Maria, but they left her with more questions than answers. What did he mean by that? Was he trying to tell her that the path she was considering wasn't as simple as it seemed? Maria couldn't shake the feeling that the storm had brought her here for a reason, and that the journey she was about to undertake was more than just a physical one.
It was if
she was being called to something deeper, something beyond what she had ever known. She couldn't stay much longer. Spirit needed her, and the storm was beginning to ease, albeit slowly. The rain had stopped, though the clouds still loomed heavy in the sky. Maria stood up, brushing the sleep from her eyes, and made her way to the window. She could see the forest stretching out before her, dark and mysterious, the trees swaying gently in the aftermath of the storm. There was something both beautiful and intimidating about it, as if the forest itself was waiting for her to make the next move. Turning back to the old man, Maria spoke. "I need to go," she said, her voice steady, but filled with uncertainty. "I don't know where I'm going, but I have to go. The storm has shown me that there's something out there, something beyond the village. I can't ignore it anymore." The old man nodded slowly, his eyes studying her with a quiet understanding. "The forest will test you," he said, his voice soft but firm. "It has its own ways, its own rules. But if you're meant to find your path, the forest will show you the way. Just remember, not every path is meant to be followed. And sometimes the hardest part is knowing when to turn back." Maria didn't fully understand his words, but she felt their weight in her heart. She had already made up her mind. She had to leave, even if it meant stepping into the unknown. The storm had taken her off course, but now it was guiding her in a new direction. She could feel the pull of something greater than herself, something that she couldn't fully explain, but something that she knew she had to follow. With a final glance at the old man, Maria stepped outside the cabin, her heart pounding with both excitement and fear. The storm was gone, but its effects lingered in the air. The forest felt different now, alive with possibility and danger. She felt the weight of the unknown pressing in on her, but she also felt something else, a sense of freedom, a sense of release. For the first time in her life, Maria felt truly free, as though she were standing at the threshold of something extraordinary. Spirit was waiting for her, his dark eyes fixed on her with a quiet understanding. Maria approached him, her heart swelling with affection. She could feel the bond between them, stronger than ever before. Together, they would face whatever lay ahead. The path was uncertain, but she wasn't afraid anymore. Whatever the future held, she was ready to face it. Maria and Spirit turned away from the cabin and began to walk into the forest. The trees loomed tall around them, but the path ahead was clear. It was a new beginning, a journey into the unknown. And though Maria didn't know what lay ahead, she knew that she was ready to find out. The storm had passed, but the adventure had only just begun. The forest was far more daunting in the light of day. What had seemed familiar during the storm now felt strange and alien, like a labyrinth of towering trees and whispering winds. Maria had always admired the forest from a distance, the way the trees stretched toward the sky, their leaves of vibrant green in the summer, their trunks strong and weathered by time. But now, as she and Spirit made their way through the dense undergrowth, she felt a deep sense of vulnerability. The storm may have passed, but the forest had taken on an entirely new character. It was no longer a place of peaceful beauty, but a vast, untamed wilderness that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. Spirit, ever the steady companion, moved with ease through the forest, his hooves making soft sounds on the damp earth. He was used to this terrain, accustomed to the dense thickets and the uneven ground that Maria now found herself stumbling over. Despite her best efforts, she struggled to keep up with him, her body weary from the long ride and the exhaustion of the storm. Her legs were sore, and her breathing was labored. She had never been a particularly strong rider, but Spirit had always carried her with ease. Now, though, her dependence on him seemed to highlight how little she understood about navigating this vast wilderness. As they continued, Maria found herself constantly scanning the trees, the rocks, and the distant hills, trying to make sense of the path ahead. The old man's words echoed in her mind. Not every path is meant to be followed.
What did he mean by that?
Was there a right path through the forest, or was the very idea of a path an illusion? Maria didn't know, but she did know one thing for certain. She couldn't afford to get lost. She had to find her way back to the village, and the longer she stayed in the forest, the more difficult it seemed to retrace her steps. The wind began to pick up again, a low, mournful howl that seemed to come from deep within the trees. The storm might have passed, but it had left behind its mark. The ground was slick with rainwater, and the branches above creaked ominously in the wind. Maria had to hold onto Spirit's reins tightly to stay on his back as they navigated the uneven terrain. Each step forward seemed to take twice as much effort as the last, and with every passing minute, her anxiety grew. The storm had been an unexpected detour, but now, it felt as if she had stumbled into something much larger than she could have imagined. Hours passed, or at least it felt that way. Time seemed to blur in the forest, the canopy above blocking out most of the sun. Maria tried to remember the landmarks from her journey the day before, but everything felt different now. The trees seemed taller, the shadows longer, and the sound of the wind more ominous. There were moments when she felt completely disoriented, as if the forest was conspiring to keep her lost, to make her doubt her ability to find her way. But through it all, Spirit remained a steady presence beneath her, his movements sure and calm, a reminder that she wasn't entirely alone. Maria paused for a moment, her hands gripping the reins tightly as she took a deep breath.
She needed to think.
The panic that had been building in her chest was starting to spill over, and she couldn't afford to let fear take control. She had to be rational, to think clearly. She closed her eyes for a moment and tried to steady her breathing. The storm had forced her into the forest, yes, but it wasn't the storm that would determine her fate. It was her own ability to adapt to this new world, to understand the landscape, and to trust her instincts. She reopened her eyes, focusing on the path ahead. Spirit was still moving steadily, but Maria knew she couldn't rely on him alone to guide her. She needed to learn how to read the forest, how to understand the subtle signs that would show her the way. The wind, the birds, the way the trees bent in certain directions, these were all clues, if only she knew how to interpret them. As she urged Spirit forward, she began to pay closer attention to her surroundings. She noticed the way certain trees seemed to cluster together, as if marking a boundary or a trail. She noticed the patches of sunlight that managed to pierce through the thick canopy above, creating spots of warmth in the otherwise cool air. She also noticed the sound of water, a stream, perhaps, flowing somewhere to her left. It was a small clue, but it was enough to push her in that direction. She trusted her instincts and urged Spirit to move toward the sound of the water, hoping it would lead her to a clearer path. The forest, though beautiful, was relentless. Every step forward was a challenge, and every decision seemed fraught with uncertainty. Maria found herself constantly second-guessing her choices, wondering if she had made the right decision to move toward the water, or if she was simply wandering deeper into the unknown. It was easy to become lost in the vastness of the forest, easy to let the doubts creep in. But as the hours passed, something began to shift within her. The fear that had gripped her at the beginning of the journey started to recede, replaced by a quiet determination. She realized that she could do this. She might not have all the answers, and she might not have the experience of someone who had lived in the forest their whole life, but she had something just as powerful, the will to survive. She pressed on, pushing herself and Spirit to continue, even when her body ached and her mind was clouded with exhaustion. The path she was following grew clearer. The the sound of the water growing louder as they approached a small stream. As they reached the water's edge, Maria allowed herself a moment to rest. She dismounted from Spirit, her legs shaky from the long ride. The stream was clear, its waters rushing over smooth stones. Maria knelt down and cupped her hands, drinking deeply. The cool water soothed her parched throat, and for the first time in hours, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. She had made it this far, and though she wasn't sure where the path would take her, she knew she was capable of continuing. It was then that Maria noticed something strange. The forest, which had once seemed so daunting, now felt more like an ally. The birds chirped in the trees, the leaves rustled gently in the breeze, and the path ahead seemed clearer than it had been before. Perhaps it was the water that had given her clarity, or perhaps it was the quiet moment of rest that had allowed her to reset her mind. Whatever it was, Maria felt more connected to the forest now, as if the land itself was guiding her forward. She stood up, taking a deep breath and glancing around. Spirit, grazing nearby, looked up at her, his dark eyes filled with quiet understanding. Together, they had faced the first wave of challenges. The forest had tested her, yes, but now she was beginning to understand it. And as she took her first steps down the path again, she realized that she wasn't just adapting to the forest, she was becoming part of it. The journey ahead would still be difficult, and there would be more challenges to overcome, but for the first time since she had entered the forest, Maria felt a sense of confidence. She knew that, with each step, she was growing stronger, and that she was learning to navigate the unfamiliar world she had found herself in. The storm had brought her here, but it was her own resilience, her ability to adapt, that would see her through to the end. With a renewed sense of purpose, Maria urged Spirit forward. The forest, once a place of fear and uncertainty, was now a space of possibility. And though she didn't know what lay ahead, she knew that with each step, she was forging a path not just through the wilderness, but through her own transformation. As the days passed, Maria and Spirit made their way deeper into the forest, and with each step, the forest seemed to become less of a challenge and more of a companion. The doubts that once clouded her mind had started to fade, replaced by a sense of purpose and determination. She had learned to read the signs of the land, the way the trees bent to mark a path, the sound of the distant stream that guided her steps, and the subtle shifts in the wind that spoke of coming weather changes. What had once felt like an overwhelming wilderness had become a vast, intricate puzzle that she was beginning to solve, piece by piece. But as confident as she had grown, the final obstacle loomed ahead. The cabin, constant undercurrent throughout her journey, began to settle into her chest like a heavy weight. Her thoughts, which had once been filled with purpose and determination, now felt muddled and uncertain. She no longer felt in control. The forest, which had once seemed like an exciting challenge, now felt like an oppressive presence, watching her every move, waiting for her to make the wrong step. The storm had passed, but the cold, biting winds had not. As night fell, Maria huddled by the dwindling fire, wrapping herself in her cloak, trying to ward off the chill that seeped into her bones. She had no idea how long she could endure this. Her body had been pushed to its limits, and though the fire warmed her temporarily, it did little to ease the deep ache in her muscles, the soreness in her joints, or the gnawing hunger that had begun to take hold of her. It wasn't just the physical toll that was wearing her down. It was the realization that, despite everything she had achieved, she had failed to truly prepare for the emotional cost of her journey. The loneliness was suffocating, and the isolation was a weight that even Spirit's comforting presence couldn't entirely alleviate. She missed the sound of human voices, the shared laughter and conversations that had once filled her life. She missed the comfort of knowing that there were people around her who cared about her, who would help her if she needed it. As the fire burned low, Maria's thoughts began to turn inward, reflecting on the choices that had brought her here. She thought about her life before the storm, the life she had left behind when she had ventured into the wilderness, chasing some unknown goal. She had believed that finding the cabin, finding shelter, would be the answer to all her problems. But it wasn't. It had only highlighted the emptiness that had been growing inside her all along. She hadn't just come to the forest to escape the storm. She had come to escape the pain, the fear, the uncertainty that had plagued her life for so long. Maria's mind wandered to her family, to the people who had once been her anchor, her source of love and security. She thought of her mother, of the nights they had spent talking by the fire, of the meals they had shared, and of the warmth of her family's embrace. She had left all of that behind in search of something she didn't fully understand. Now, in the solitude of the cabin, she understood that what she had been searching for wasn't out here in the wilderness. It was back home, in the familiar faces of those she had left behind. Her heart ached at the thought of her family, and a surge of guilt flooded her chest. She had believed that by leaving, by forging her own path, she would find something greater than what she had left behind. But all she had found was emptiness. She had traded the warmth of her family for the cold isolation of the forest, and the price she had paid was far higher than she had ever anticipated. And then there was Spirit, the loyal horse who had accompanied her through every hardship, every challenge, and every moment of fear. Spirit had been her constant companion, her protector, and her source of strength. But Maria could not shake the feeling that she had burdened the horse with more than he could bear. He was strong, yes, but he was not invincible. He had grown tired, too, and Maria could feel it in the way he moved more slowly now, in the way his steps seemed less sure, less confident. She had asked so much of him, and though he never complained, she could see the toll it had taken on him. It was a reminder that her journey was not just about her own survival. It was about the survival of those who had chosen to walk alongside her. The fire flickered and dimmed, and the cabin grew colder still. Maria closed her eyes, trying to shut out the thoughts that swirled in her mind. She had never felt so alone. The sense of accomplishment she had felt earlier, when she had found the cabin, had dissipated. Now, she realized that the cabin had not been a victory. It had been a false refuge, a temporary solution to a much deeper problem. She had come here seeking safety, but all she had found was a reflection of the emptiness she had been running from. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the cabin's walls and sending cold gusts of air through the cracks in the windows. The storm had passed, but the elements were still unforgiving. Maria pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders, but it did little to ward off the chill that had settled deep in her bones. She felt a sense of helplessness wash over her, a feeling she hadn't experienced since the storm had first driven her into the forest. She had thought that by reaching the cabin, she had found the answer. But now, she understood that the real answer wasn't about finding shelter or surviving the storm. It was about facing the truth, about facing the reality of what she had left behind, and what she had sacrificed in her pursuit of something she could not define. The truth was that Maria had been searching for something more than just physical survival. She had been searching for meaning, for connection, for a sense of belonging. And now, in the quiet solitude of the cabin, she realized that no matter how far she ventured into the wilderness, no matter how many battles she fought or obstacles she overcame, she could never outrun the need for human connection. It was a truth she had been avoiding for too long. She sat in silence, staring into the dying embers of the fire, lost in thought. The cost of her journey had been greater than she could have imagined. It had cost her the warmth of human connection, the safety of familiar faces, and the certainty of love and companionship. And in its place, it had left her with a deeper understanding of her own loneliness, her own isolation. It was a painful realization, but it was also a necessary one. As the night wore on, Maria knew that she had to make a choice. She could continue to hide in the cabin, clinging to the illusion of safety, or she could face the reality of her situation and venture back into the wilderness, not to survive, but to truly understand what it meant to live. The storm had passed, but the real journey was just beginning. And for the first time, Maria was ready to face it. The early morning sun had finally started to peek through the cracks in the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. Maria sat in the now quiet cabin, the embers of the fire long since extinct.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.